Are you ready to dig deeper into the Aerophone app and take control? How about this? So I've spent weeks digging through the reference guide. I've tested things out to make this series. I've puzzled over the details to see how everything interacts. I've written and rewritten this script as I've found out more subtle details. If you watched the first two videos in this series, you're itching to dig deeper into the Aerophone. So in this video, I'm going to show you how to set up the controls and then choose a tone. It's a complicated instrument that's best summarized as being of three parts. The AE has controls. There's the physical instrument with all the buttons and the keys and the thumb wheel and the sensors and the breath and the bite. The AE-30 also has the touch sensitive thumb pad and the motion controls. So as well as the controls, they're the sound engines, the Supernatural and the Zen Core that make the sounds. And in the middle, software mediates between the two. When you play the Aerophone, it generates MIDI instructions, and there's several levels of configuration that controls those changes to the MIDI. Some go direct to the sound engines, but others get modified on the way. There are several levels of configuration where you can control what happens. My mistake was to dig too deep too soon. So I started over and worked my way through layer by layer. Today we're looking at the scene layer. Before we start the app, we've got to make sure that the scenes have control. One thing with the Aerophone is you can have the system settings override the scene settings, but for most of the things I want the scenes to have control. So let's take a look at the Aerophone. For transpose mode, I want the system to have control. I want the bend range source to be the scene, the thumb pad sensor to be 5 by default, and I want the assigned settings to be scene. Now for the app. As usual, I'm starting with the init scene and we'll go to the editor screen. This time round, we're interested in the three buttons across the bottom, the common, the internal, and the MIDI Out. These three buttons are where we set up the MIDI commands to go to the internal sound engines or to external synthesizers. Before we get into the details, let's have a quick overview of what's behind each of these buttons. The common page is where we set the overall scene parameters. If you have the AE-20, you won't see some of these items because I have the AE-30. The internal page is a matrix. It's analogous to the modulation matrix you get on a hardware synthesizer such as the Arturia Microfreak. At the top is the control source matrix. We're not going to go into this in this video, it's a whole video by itself. Below that, on the left side are the controllers. It starts with the continuously variable controllers and then is followed by the switches, which generally toggle on or off. On the right hand side, you can see which assignments have been made or are still available. For each of these, there's an assignment page. Looking at the assignment page, we can see which control has been assigned to be sent to the sound engine. We can choose different characteristics for each assignment, so we could send a lot of bite but only a little thumb pad. It's important to understand that just because we set up a control, the sound engine might not respond to it. A tone can be set up to ignore a particular control. We'll be covering that in a later video. So now let's take a look at the MIDI Out page. The MIDI Out page is basically the same as the internal page. It's where we define the controls that are going to be sent out to external synthesizers, whether those are hardware synths or soft synths. I cover this in other videos. It's important to know that you can do both at the same time. You can have the sound engines being played as well as controlling external devices. So the basic flow is the common page to the internal page and the assignment pages through to the sound engine. That's the overview, so now to dig deep. So let's look at the common page. First up is the scene volume. You want to set this so that after you've designed your scene, it's about the same loudness as the other scenes. Scene tempo sets a common timing for delays and low frequency oscillators and things like that. It's a whole video in itself, so we're going to leave it for now. For scene transpose, as I said earlier, my Aerophone is set up to system so that I can use the control knob. Scene octave shift is handy to keep bass sounds in a normal key range. Next are the bend range settings. The controller setting sets the overall bend range, and the bite settings obviously set the bite. For the motion down and the motion up, it's fun to set the pitch bend, but there's horrible stepping, so it's not very useful. It says down and up, but it's not just elevation. If you've assigned the tilt will also affect the pitch bend. Let's demonstrate with the bite down setting. I like to set the bite down to 70 cents to just give that little bit more bend to the vibrato. Now for the motion settings. The elevation is self-evident, but for tilt there's several options. For the motion sensors to work, you have to assign them, so I'll be demonstrating those when we look at the internal page. I'll be including pitch bend, so be patient and then you can hear just how horrible it can sound. Next up is the harmony. The AE-30 has two harmony options. The normal has fixed intervals, but the intelligent adjusts the interval according to the scale. The AE-20 only has normal. So let's look at the normal first. We'll switch the harmony on. It's quite straightforward to set the harmony. An octave below is quite handy for adding a simple sub-octave to a synthesizer sound. The AE-30 has extra harmony settings. You can choose between a scale tune that you've set up or just. Scales are another thing that need a video all just for themselves. So let's take a look at the AE-30's intelligent harmony. We can set whether major or minor, and we can choose the key. For intelligent harmony, the init scene doesn't have an interval selected, so I'm just going to go with a fourth below. If I toggle between normal and intelligent, you can hear the change. And now let's switch to minor. So now we're going to deep dive on the internal page. Let's make some settings. So what if I take off expression? What difference does it make? The difference is a bit hard to hear for that one, so let's take off the second assignment. So you can definitely hear that one. That's pretty obvious, the difference there. This is a good example for hearing the effect of the other settings. Let's find out what happens when we adjust these input and output settings. So increasing the input minimum means that I have to blow harder before I start getting a sound. With the input max brought down halfway, I only have to blow half as hard for it to be full strength. And there's no change if I try to blow any harder. What happens if I set input max to 0? I just get full on for every single note. So now let's find out what happens when I set the input minimum to 127 and the input maximum to 0. So that was pretty weird. It's inverted. The harder I blow, the quieter it gets. So the note started out full but then went quiet until I eased off on my breath. That is something that can be pretty useful. Right, so let's put the minimum and maximum back to their usual settings and we'll play with the output settings. So we're going to set the output minimum halfway. This way it starts at half volume even with minimum breath. Let's try maximum. So this time, no matter how hard I blow, it still won't go above halfway. Now for the curves. So as you can see, curve 1 is linear and the tone and the volume change with the breath. With curve 4, it changes very little at the beginning and then lots as I blow harder. With curve 8, there's lots at first, but very little difference at the end. So curve 10 seems to jump quickly between your minimum and maximum amounts of breath, whereas curve 11 is the opposite. It feels very mushy to play, and you'd expect curve 12 to be like a switch. Curve 12 is quite annoying. So let's quickly switch back to the default. So looking at this again, curve 6 is being used to send the expression and curve 1 is being used for the breath. What that means is the expression curve is a bit more reactive. The expression being sent to the sound engine is more responsive than the breath being sent. And that's it for the curves. I'm not going to change them, but let's just look at the bite settings. So bite down is going to bend down, and bite up is going to bend up. On the AE-30, a lot of the scenes use the thumb pad to send growl. but I can do growl just by gargling like this. As you can hear, there's not much difference, so there's no point in me using the thumb pad for growl. I can use it for something more interesting. What I do like to add is synth vibrato using the thumb pad. Synth vibrato is different to creating vibrato with your bite. It has a different kind of emotional feel to it, especially on synth lead lines, and so that's what I like to send using the thumb pad. The AE-20 has no thumb pad, so just for an example, I'm going to use the thumb lever down. As you can hear, it's a bit strong and it's a bit fast. So how do we limit the strength? We use the output max. So how do we control the frequency? We're going to use assign 2 to control the vibrato rate. Now if you listen carefully, it now goes from too slow to too fast. What that means is we need to set the output max and the output minimum to bring it into a smaller range. It's time to restore the thumb lever to bend down and move on to the AE-30 thumb pad. And now for the thumb pad. So we're going to go in and set it up. The assign function, changing to CC01 modulation. It's close, but that's not quite the effect I'm looking for. I want it a bit more refined. I want it to ease in. So the thumb pad has a different response to the thumb lever. The thumb pad is all about feel. So we're going to start with the curve. Three's a bit too strong. I've got the feel okay, but it starts too easily. We want to hold off the start, which means we're going to adjust the input minimum. And to save you watching me experiment, we're going to go for 8. Right, so now we want to set the vibrato rate. So that's clearly going from too slow to too fast too quickly. So we're going to set the output max and the output minimum. It's close, but the vibrato speed is changing a bit too quick. Next up is motion. As you're probably aware, this is only for the AE-30. I'm a big fan of analog synthesizers, and a big part of that is the filter. So many synths have a small keyboard, and that's because with one hand you're playing and with the other hand you're busy waggling the controls. Now with the AE-30, I like to use elevation for the cutoff frequency and tilt for the resonance. Now to set up the cutoff frequency for the elevation. You can hear that it's a bit too strong. It's very muted, so I need to set the minimum. So I want to hold off the increase in brightness, so I'm going to set curve 2. That's a much better response. Now for tilt. But while we're here, I promised the pitch bend, so here we go. I warned you it sounded bad. Having set it up on the internal page, we now switch back to the common page to adjust the motion down setting. So you notice that tilt has the same effect both ways. So let's look at some of the other tilt settings. So you notice this time the full range is from hard left to hard right. So now let's try tilt left. This is where my playing differs from what Roland anticipated. To them, tilt left is this. And that's the same as rolling to the right for me. Similarly, tilt right is they intended a swing to the right, whereas for me it's a roll to the left. I think they didn't anticipate people using elevation and tilt at the same time the way I do. The way I play has an opposite logic, so if I use it to control pan with tilt, it's the opposite way that I expect, I would invert the signal using input min and max. One of the useful things you could do with tilt left and tilt right is if you didn't want to use the elevation, you could set motion 1 and motion 2, and you could bring in different effects by tilting left or tilting right. So here I've set motion 1 and 2. By setting them that way, tilting one way controlled the filter cutoff and tilting the other way controlled the pitch. I generally use the tilt option. Right, so the fun is over and it's back to work. So we'll set the elevation and the tilt. And we need to turn off the motion, pitch bend. Right, so switch to the internal. We want the motion. Assign function 2. And I want to make it resonance. Okay. There we go. I've obviously tried this out before, and the curve I want is curve 9. So can you hear the difference there in the tone? So as I tilt the aerophone, it increases the resonance, which makes it a more peaky kind of sound. Did you notice anything else that was going on then? The breath was also controlling the cutoff, and that gives us a lot more flexibility. So we're not finished here yet, because we want to set the switch for harmony. Most of the scenes, you probably know by now, use S2 to enable you to switch harmony on and off. So S2 is the lower button on the back, which you operate with the side of your thumb. S2. It's right near the end. We don't want to have to hold the button on all the time to have the harmony, so we need to make it so that it latches. So let's give it a try. So we've set up the obvious named items such as cutoff, resonance, but what about other parameters? What about effects parameters? How about we pick a tone that's more exciting than the init scene? But before we do that, if you're finding this video interesting, please let me know by clicking like and subscribing. So let's go further now. What I want to do is control the MFX parameters. To control this effect, we're going to use the S1 switch on the back of the aerophone. As you've seen before, there's lots of controls, and for this we want to choose one that's not used for anything specific. So we're going to go to Internal. So I'm going to use this general one, CC16, and we want it to latch. We've set the switch, so now let's go to the MFX. Press and hold on MFX and switch off Follow Tone MFX. We now want to choose the MFX type. For this one I wanted a delay, and I want the modulation delay, number 38. So for the delay left we want to switch on the sync switch, and for delay right as well. So the feedback is what we're going to control. So I want to set a minimum here of +10. Set the high frequency damp to 5 kHz. Now for rate sync. For some reason the rate sync acts like a detune. I'm not exactly sure why, so I tone it down a bit. Now for depth, 21, and the low gain +3, and the high gain +3. Now the balance I want to set to 86. And now we get to the exciting bit, the Send Control tab. So I want the chorus to be max, and the reverb as well. And now for the important bit, the Control 1 source. If you remember, we set it to CC16 General 1. Now the destination, I want to set it to the feedback. And the sensitivity, I want to set to +22. So you remember I set the feedback to +10. When we press the S1 switch, it'll now be 32. Now I'll demonstrate it, the first time with the reduced feedback and then the second time with the increased feedback. Right, so that's great. We now have control of an effect, but really I want to have a more exciting sound than that. So to change the tone is pretty easy. Tap on the tone and then you just try them out and then stick with one that you like. To save you sitting there while I go through all the different tones, I'm going to jump straight to the one that I've chosen. So I've already been through all of these tones to choose what I'd like, and the one that I've chosen is number 19, AE Mod Swallow. So the only issue with this tone is that the thumb pad does nothing. The tone is ignoring that. That's the sort of thing we'll get into in future videos. So as well as internal sounds, the AE-30 makes a great MIDI controller. The MIDI Out page is where you configure it for external hardware synths or soft synths. So I've got a video that explains the details of that. Let me know if you'd like me to make more videos like this by clicking like, subscribing and leaving a comment. Thanks for watching. Take care.